I've been thinking a lot about language and how the language that we use can either bring people in or keep them out of engaging in our movement to end sexual and intimate partner violence. Any of us who work or have worked in prevention knows that we love our terminology. But when we talk about how we center communities who are most impacted by violence, it's really important that we take a look at what language we're using, how it serves us, and how it hurts us. For this episode of Prevent Connect, we're actually uplifting an episode of another podcast in the movement to end sexual violence, Both And, hosted by my friend and colleague Jess Clark from the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs. I was on Both And earlier this year to talk about how language keeps folks out of our movement, starting with the imposter syndrome that a lot of us working in the movement feel when we start interacting with terminology. We are so grateful that they let us use that episode on Prevent Connect. So once you're done listening here, go over and check out some of the incredible work that they have. You can find them on Buzzsprout and wherever you listen to podcasts. But for now, enjoy Jess, myself, and Both And.
Welcome to Both And, Sexual Violence Prevention Podcast. I'm Jess Clark, Director of Prevention for the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, and your host. Today's guest is Janae Sargent, Project Coordinator for Valor. After working in print and broadcast journalism for several years, Janae transitioned into the anti-violence field as a community organizer and prevention practitioner. Their work has primarily included TGI justice, reproductive justice, and community-level prevention. And at Valor, she coordinates the day-to-day activities of Prevent Connect and advances policy initiatives. Janae's history in our movement made her the absolutely perfect person to talk with about how the language we use to describe prevention can limit our ability to reach the communities we know should be centered and become a barrier to talented and passionate and just straight up fun people getting in and staying in prevention. If you want to know more about Janae's work at Valor, check out the links in the show notes. Enjoy. So I got connected to you through your podcast, Prevent Connect, from the organization Prevent Connect. Mm-hmm. And also through you hosting various trainings and such. And so much of this podcast has been me coming across folks and going, oh my gosh, I really want to talk to them. I don't know what I want to talk to them about, but I really want to talk to them. And that has been the case with you. So I'm super stoked that you were excited about coming on. Yay, welcome, welcome.
I was so excited when you reached out. I'm really excited to be talking. Thanks for having me.
How did you get to this work? What's your origin story?
I grew up experiencing sexual and domestic violence. It was a generational thing. My mom experienced it. My sister experienced it. I experienced it. And when I was younger, I followed the trajectory of what a lot of people think that activism in anti-sexual and domestic violence looks like, which means sharing your story everywhere that you can. I started doing that at a really young age. That is an important part to people's healing. And for me was like the first stage of what has been a really powerful evolution in this movement. In college, I did a lot of activism around sexual violence and simultaneously was pursuing a journalism degree. I did a lot of reporting around reporting systems and broken reporting systems. And I was feeling really burnt out because I was like, okay, to end sexual and domestic violence, I have to constantly share myself, re-traumatize myself, open myself up to others. And so I left for a few years. I was like, I can't do that anymore. I am more than my experience and more than my trauma. I worked as a journalist in Oregon and California. I came to where I currently live on the Central Coast, was working at a news station here and saw a tweet because we all had to be on Twitter all the time as journalists for the local rape crisis center. Yeah, I get like...
Back when Twitter was like the thing.
The thing. I was
before the fall of the Twitter. Yeah.
Yes. I remember when I joined Prevent Connect, they were like, and you will need to tweet. I was like, oh gosh, please no. But I saw a tweet advertising for a preventionist job and I interviewed, and that was like the veil lifted for me because there was a way to be in this movement and actually work toward the end of sexual and domestic violence versus just talking about the problem. And I started making all these connections that I subliminally knew as a child about the connections between oppression, systemic oppression, and sexual and domestic violence. This time, there were actual words and data and studies that backed that up. I'm a Virgo, so I was like, we love a solution. And I've been here for about 5 or 6 years now.
Was the storytelling during the Take Back the Night phenomenon, was that during that kind of time?
It was. Yeah, I look back. We have to give ourselves grace. We all do what we do. We do the best that we can with what we have. There are photos of me leading a Take Back the Night march. And then, unfortunately, and I cringe about this, but I'm like, young Janae did the best they could. I did a whole walk a mile in her shoes thing at my college. And I'm like, was it? You know what? It was important for me at the time. It was the 2000s. And now when I share about why some of those things aren't the best way to end violence, I can speak from experience that I did them.
Hard same. I also came up during the Take Back the Night phenomenon. And it was funny because I remember it feeling off to me at the time, not to be to use a 2000s word, a hipster about it. And, if we're talking about the 2000s, may as well be in it. It felt off to me at the time, even though I was like actively participating and I didn't have the words or the context for why it didn't feel great. And it wasn't until like well over a decade later that I went, oh, this doesn't feel good because there's no container for the stories that are shared. But it was also this idea that our stories were bargaining chips for access to care. And that never sat so well. So yeah, right there with you. It was a thing that we did with the information we had at the time. And now we know differently.
I used to feel some shame around it. And now I look back and be like, I felt empowered at the time. The survivors that I was with felt empowered at the time. And it served a purpose to us. And now we have all grown in our own ways and can come back to that work. I know that we'll get into this in this conversation, but it feels like the general conversation around gender and power-based violence is either really heavy, traumatizing stories of victimization and survival, or really academic language about public health that doesn't resonate. And there's no middle ground, which I'm really interested in working in the middle ground.
That's the whole point of this podcast, is that we get to be in all of it all at once. There is no one right answer ever, almost. I love that you put your origin story not just in the context of, I went to school for this, I had this job, and then I came into this, which is so often the route that so many of us take when we tell our how did we get into this work story. And I've been really interested in shifting that. I love that you did that, is that this was actually my life. This was my life, and this is the lives of so many people in this movement, and we so often forget that. So I love that you really wove that into your origin story, and that prevention became the space where you could be in this work and not feel totally bogged down all the time.
There are so many jobs that you could have out there where you can take off your personal hat and put on your professional hat. That's what we're all taught that we're supposed to do. I was raised by a single dad. He was a construction worker. He was very much, you leave your personal business at home, you become the big tough guy when you go to work, and you demand respect. And so when I got into this quote unquote work, I'm doing air quotes, it was a really tough transition for me, because I was like, you want to know about Janae the person? No, thank you. I can't do that. That's not comfortable for me. We're all here for a reason. And I have had some struggles with vulnerability in the past of like, it's an opportunity for us to be brave. Yes, we get paid to do this work, and interpersonal violence is a personal issue. Yes, it is a public health issue. Yes, it is something that we should be spending federal and state dollars on. And it's something that happens in all of our hearts. So to be doing this without bringing our hearts into it can be such a disservice to the folks that we're doing this work for and to ourselves. But that's been a very new part of my journey. I don't want to present myself as an expert because I'm a little baby when it comes to that.
That's a really good shift into our topic for today, is talking about language and how language is a reflection of our values as a movement. When it does reflect our values, when it doesn't reflect our values, how it shapes our movement, how we shape the language, and all of the interconnected pieces there. So you've been in this for a while, and so you've seen from the Take Back the Night, where it was all heart, shift from that to highly academic. And the language that we use to talk about the Air Bunny's work has shifted so much during that time. I've been officially employed in this movement for almost 13 years, but involved since I was a teenager. But even in those 13 years, the changes are huge. So can you talk a little bit about how that language shifted for you during your time in the movement, and how have those shifts shaped prevention spaces that you've been engaged with?
It's shifted in every single new role that I have occupied in this movement. It has shifted yet again. So when I first joined the Rape Crisis Center, all of the prevention training that I did, it was about learning about the social ecological model. It was about learning about risk and protective factors. It was about learning primary, secondary, tertiary prevention. It was about becoming an expert. And an expert meant knowing certain words and knowing what those words meant. And that's a hard thing for people to understand, to get on board with. I remember feeling really stupid when I first got into this work for things that I said or thought, and adapting to that language. And then you put on understanding, what does RFP mean? What are objectives? What are all of these different things? And it really feels like learning a new language. And when I finally felt like I understood that, I was a prevention manager. I knew all the lingo. I was really successful in my own mind. Successful, air quotes. I joined the state coalition. I joined Valor, and I joined Prevent Connect. And oh my goodness, I felt so stupid yet again. I felt like I was back to that original place. I knew nothing about prevention. When I entered this job that I currently have, I felt like such an expert. I was like, I know what prevention looks like. I know what it looks like in communities. So I am totally equipped to help folks think through what prevention looks like. But then when I got here, people were using terms like health equity and greening strategies for violence prevention, and just all of these things that I remember sitting in meetings and pulling my hair out with my camera off, being like, I have no idea what anyone is talking about. I really don't. How am I supposed to teach folks about this stuff when I don't even know about this stuff? And I was so wrapped up in, you have to learn the terminology to be able to operate in these spaces. For a long time, I felt like I couldn't even speak. When I was talking to other national technical assistance providers, or when I was talking to the CDC, all of these folks who had public health degrees and who have been published, and it just felt like they were operating in a totally different league than I was. And I really racked my brain over, how can I become like these folks to be an expert? And in the midst of feeling that shame, feeling that insecurity, I lost sight of the fact that I was an expert and that I could bring something to the table. Now, about a year and a half ago, I thought that this just wasn't for me. I thought, I'm never going to be that person. I believe in community-rooted prevention. I don't want to feel stupid anymore. I don't want to have an inferiority complex anymore. And so I stepped away. I told my supervisor that this wasn't it for me. And I left for a little while. And I remember reflecting while I was gone about, what would it mean if I genuinely was an expert in my own right? What would those spaces be like if, instead of trying to conform or silence myself, that I actually said the things that I was afraid to say? And if people's silence, maybe that wasn't a reflection of me being stupid. That was a reflection of people needing to hear what I had to say. And I was really fortunate to be able to come back. And I feel like I have a new lens on language and what happens when we get too disconnected, when we get too far from the why that we're doing this.
I also do not have an MPH, and I came to the rape crisis space and suddenly was learning all about primary prevention, the social ecological model, and hey now and what. I remember the first RFP I responded to from our State Department of Health. They'd been prepping us for a while to actually respond to this capably, which was really wonderful that they did that. They spent a full year and a half really preparing us for this. And one of those sessions was about the difference between a goal and an objective because we had to write. Yeah. And so I remember printing out the slides and having them behind me because my brain could not understand the difference between those two. I know it is a simple thing, but something had me really stuck. And we get so caught up in the minutia of language around such things. And that if you don't get it, then what, are you not going to get the grant? And what's going to happen? Are you going to look like you don't know what you're talking about? Even though you really do know what you're talking about. I got so caught up in it that I was so focused on getting everything exactly right. And I have not been someone who's enjoyed school, formal education. It's never been my thing. And I love learning. And so on one hand, it was really fun to learn about this whole new world. I dove right in. It was great. And I felt like I did not know what I was doing a whole lot of the time and really had to perform expertise in a way that in some ways kept me from learning more deeply because I felt like I had to seem like I knew what I was doing. And then once I got into the coalition space, once I was in national spaces, again, everything I felt like I had no clue what I was doing. And almost all of the other people in my position across the country have masters in public health. I do not. And that imposter syndrome is just so relentless sometimes. And I love that reframe of, no, I am an expert. It just doesn't have to look like this. And my personal reframe has been that part of what makes me good at this is that I can translate that language into something that other people can understand who don't come up in public health spaces, which most prevention programs that I work with, folks aren't coming up in public health spaces. And so if I'm just using that language and expecting people to come along, it's not going to work. And it's going to really hurt our relationship. I don't want to do that. I don't want to make folks feel bad.
Yeah.
And that's a hard shift when it's the outside world, the government agencies that are saying you need to use all of these things. And I do think there's value in understanding that. But when we're talking to the public, what should it actually look like?
And I'm feeling undertones of white supremacy. I am, but
Yeah.
you're right. On one hand, yes, there is a purpose for all of that language. Absolutely. And we know that the movement to end sexual and domestic violence has had a rough job retaining folks who do not fit certain demographics. Typically, those are white, academic demographics. And we say that we don't want to do that anymore. We say that we want to bring folks along. We say that we want to be rooted in community. And so we have to really be intentional about what are all of the ways that we're shutting people out. I think about myself and all the privilege that I hold, right? I did feel like an imposter, and it was really hard for me to stay in. And I have so many things working for me that set me up to be successful in spaces where white supremacy is present. I am white. There are so many things that I don't have to grapple with in addition to the things that I already do. And we have to be really open about the ways in which we hold power in this movement, especially those of us in coalition and national spaces. And I'm not going to say that it's not hard. And I know that we'll get into this a little bit. I'm not saying that like we are all dumb for not doing this. It is hard to walk the line of doing both because you have to understand the academic language to play ball, to get the money that you need to get, and to understand some of the new evidence that comes out. You need to know when that is useful. You also need to know when to put that down. And you have to be willing to look at yourself and think about all of the ways in which you have used language to exert power.
Yeah, language in so many cases, just one more layer of gatekeeping that keeps community programs who are doing really good work from accessing funding, from being in the space. And I imagine that is not unintentional, also known as intentional, in that so much of that community-based work is the work that is actually going to dramatically shift things. And my little conspiracy theory brain always goes to, do we put up lots of barriers because we're not actually ready for those changes? Or because we need them to be far more gradual? We're not ready for the big movement-wide shift that'll happen if we really dive into those changes? Or is it just that we really like to cling on to things that feel safe, and academic language feels safe for folks in academia, it feels safe for government agencies because it's something you can point to and say, see, it works. And this word means that it works. And I was doing very dramatic gesturing there. And my 6-year-old, every time we talk about reading with other people, she's really quick to point out that I do voices for all of the characters. And there's a lot of bravery or comfort with the unknown that comes along with, hey, we don't actually have the exact evidence that says this thing works, but here's a community saying, this is what we need. And there's a lot of discomfort in saying, okay, we're going to try that and see how it goes. Or, hey, can we connect what you're doing back to what we know works? And how can we use the language that exists to describe the thing that you're already doing? Is that something we can do? I feel half the time my job is talking with programs and helping them describe the work that they already do brilliantly in terms that the government can understand.
Yeah,
and it's challenging.
It is. To your question earlier, is it fear or comfort? Not to play on the title of this podcast, it's both and.
Always is.
It always is. There are certain folks in this movement who want to keep people out. There are other folks in this movement, and I see this all the time, who really want to bring people in. With Prevent Connect, we host all of these national dialogues. And when you boil down what is health equity, what does it actually mean? Get rid of all of the minutia. It really means bringing people in. I always hear that coalitions want to bring community-based organizations in, want to bring grassroots organizations in, but they're always like, but we don't know where they are, or we can't connect with them, or we're having all of these challenges. And it's okay, great. That's the value. Hang on to that value. Now we're going to have a really tough conversation about all the things that exist that are not necessarily your fault, that are making it so that those organizations don't trust you. You mentioned, do we need evidence to trust communities? We know that academia is awesome, and all of the things that we have evidence for is far behind the communities that already knew that it was needed. Part of health equity right now is you have communities who've been doing this for a long time and are like, wait, you just gave me a dictionary lesson on something that I've been doing for decades. That feels condescending. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. And knowing that we don't have to push our language on everybody. Sometimes it's about us adjusting. I was hosting a web conference series last year called Health Equity in Practice. And one of our sessions was on language. And I think it was the Colorado Department of Public Health. They were one of our guests, and were sharing about their work to bring folks in, and that they just started cold calling organizations that they knew were connected. This was specifically around economic justice. Like they had money to give out, and they just started calling folks. They didn't wait for people to come to them. And they had genuine human to human conversations, not like we think that you might fit the grant objectives to apply for this RFP to get this violence prevention funding, because a lot of folks, they didn't see themselves as violence prevention organizations because we've never talked about them that way before. It takes a lot to be brave, and it takes a lot of intentionality. And it doesn't mean throw the language out the window at all. It just means hold space for both and.
And there's so much power that places like departments of health have in shaping that. And that when it's done well, it's amazing. Our local Department of Health has recently shifted contract language. One word, a shift in one word is what is going to allow some organizations who historically have not been funded to come into this. In New Mexico, we do evidence informed is what's required. And it shifted it to evidence/culturally informed. And that one word, so I was at our quarterly prevention meeting talking about this shift, and I kept being, y'all, this is a really big deal. I don't think you understand how big of a deal this is, because it's this one word in a government contract that is talking about what we value in New Mexico. And we know that a program created on the East Coast, when you put it in rural northern New Mexico, and especially in indigenous spaces in northern New Mexico, it's just not going to work. It's just not going to happen. And so we can't do that, but we can take the evidence and we can inform our work. But also we really need that to be culturally informed. We need our programming to reflect the communities that we're in. And that one word says this is as important as the evidence. And it took one person within a state agency who really got it to go, hey, we should shift this. And hopefully that will really open the doors for community-based programs to come in. And already it has. So much of this work can feel really bogged down by bureaucracy. And when we can have bureaucracy work for us in those little ways that can actually make on-the-ground changes, it feels like the biggest win. Even with just one word. It's magical.
Jess, that's incredible. That's a huge win. I was thinking about what my experience might be if I were reading that RFP and if I read evidence informed. Although to us working in the movement who know the evidence, we're like, oh, that's so much better than evidence based.
Yeah.
But if I was reading that, if I didn't know what the evidence was, then I would say, this is not for me. And I would shut the books and I would not apply for it. Culturally informed, there's so much more breathing room for that. Evidence informed tells me I need to know studies about prevention. I need to know prevention in a box to be able to do this. Culturally informed tells me I need to know about my community, which is really what we want. Because the evidence says that connected communities, or I should say, the evidence says that connected communities prevent sexual violence. Everybody that lives in communities knows what a connected community is. You don't have to know. That is an essential element of health equity, to know that a connected community equals less violence. Sorry, I'll put my karaoke mic down.
That was magical. I don't think I've ever had anyone on this podcast meet me with the singing. So this is great. Yay. I've sung Daniel Tiger more than once on this podcast because Daniel Tiger is very wise. So one really great example of how language has shifted that started in community, shifted into academic language, and now we're trying to bring back to community is we're going to call it the anti-oppression to health equity to anti-oppression pipeline, or anti-oppression to health equity to a culturally informed pipeline. Maybe we'll go with that.
Love it.
I'll take it. Can you talk a little bit about what that shift has been like for you as you witnessed it through these years?
Yes. Oh my goodness. And I'm so glad that you asked this. I had a recent experience about this. So I'm really happy to be able to tell this story. Again, when I came to the coalition space, I was like, I know prevention because I know anti-oppression. And then when I got here and everyone started using health equity, I was like, what the heck does that mean? When I was talking about anti-equity, what's health equity? What is health equity? And I learned about health equity, and I remember sitting there like scratching my head and being like, so you mean anti-oppression? I'm pretty sure you're saying that, but you're telling me that I'm wrong and I don't understand. And I remember, because I'm Virgo, I drew out a Venn diagram when I was in a meeting.
Are you more than a single Virgo? Are you like a double or a triple Virgo?
I'm not. I'm just like a really strong Virgo.
Okay, great. Excellent.
But I'm a Virgo and an Aries. So my Aries made me really passionate about my Venn diagram. Where the differences between those two things come from is how people practice them. To me, anti-oppression is like in the streets activism, calling out oppression when you see it. In some communities, even health equity, I hear that it's really hard for people to get on board with. But to me, that seems like the more palatable version of anti-oppression. That's how I came to it in my mind. Both of them acknowledge that there are systems in place that make it so that people do not have an equal shot at life. Both of them acknowledge that racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, classism, that all of that affects people's life. Anti-oppression calls out those systems very explicitly, and health equity calls out what those systems create. So health equity calls out poverty, inequitable access to health care, unequal housing practices, and hiring practices that we know are rooted in racism. I get a lot of requests from folks asking me to go into the differences between anti-oppression and health equity. And it's something that I've struggled with as a TA provider. Again, acknowledging the differences in how they are implemented and talked about. For me, whatever you vibe with, go with that one. It actually doesn't matter. The thing that matters is that if you are writing a grant, you might use the word health equity. If you're talking to your neighbor or a fellow activist, you might use the word anti-oppression. But what matters is that you understand your why, and that both of those things are aligned with your why. And that was something that I came across recently. I was in Idaho doing a day-long session with some folks, and we were talking about the similarities and differences. And that was really the conversation. It was much less, what do these two mean? And much more, which one resonates with me?
I love that. And that one is not more correct than the other. It's every term has a place. And what's going to resonate with me, what's going to vibe with me. Again, both of those sound super Santa Fe. I must be rocking something today. You would fit in. You've got the Virgo, you're good to go. But also what's going to work for the folks that I'm talking to. So often with any kind of prevention messaging, it's the singer, not the song, but also it's the arrangement, not the song. It's the message can be exactly the same, but how is it arranged so that folks can take it in and really start some good head bobbing with it?
And that is something that preventionists have a lot of skill around.
That's our whole thing.
It's our whole thing. How many times have we gone into a school and talked about our prevention work in a way that meets the needs of school communities? Or same thing with any kind of community-based prevention strategy. The further we get up into the academic language, the less we're willing to budge. And that is cultural competency. I hear with national landscape around messaging really shifting and things becoming really heated in some states, to me, health equity seems watered down, right? I live in California. I'm like, we should be doing anti-oppression. And then I hear some folks saying, no, I can't even say health equity. Health equity is really controversial here. But I'm hearing from my grant officer that I need to be doing health equity. I can't even say health equity. And that's where when we can let go of the terminology and talk about what it means and connect with folks about what it means, find commonalities between people, exercise those muscles that we all had when we were in our first prevention job. That's when we can be really successful. Like, awesome, great, use the language, use it to get what you need, and still be that 24-year-old preventionist that was doing the work. Don't let that person go. That person is so important.
You can let go of some parts, for sure.
Sure. You can let go of take half the night, but don't let go of like the skills that they had.
So many of us come into this as 20-something really eager prevention folks. And you can spot a prevention person in a room. They look just real excited generally. Like I'll go into a conference room and it's a mix of folks in all kinds of areas in this work. And I can always spot out the prevention person because they're sitting up extra straight and really excited about the learning, and also going to be the one to be like, hey, but have you thought about that term that you just used that isn't so great? Because that is what we do.
What we do.
And
I love them.
It's what we do. I have more of a comment than a question. I have been that guy.
I have too. I've been that guy, and I've also been the person on the other end that's, oh, here we go.
No. Yes. Same. I've been on both ends of that. And along the way, as we become professionalized, some of that moxie that we have coming in really gets lost. And some of that moxie is what first drew us to the work in the first place, but also is what made us so effective in those spaces in many ways. And in some ways, not so much. And it's interesting to think about the individual experience being so parallel to the movement experience in terms of shifting into hyper-professionalization. I've only ever thought about it as the movement, but actually we are individuals acting within this larger system. So of course it is individual as well. But can you talk a little bit about how the prevention space has become increasingly professionalized? How has that shifted the work? How has that shifted the ways that we talk about the work and the individual people doing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I was having this conversation with someone at Valor who has been in this movement long before I have. And he was sharing about the benefits of the professionalization of the movement. Because for me, it's always like grass is greener, right? Where I'm like, this shouldn't be professionalized. These are people's lives. We should be doing this work, da, 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 da. And he very lovingly challenged that and said, I was doing this work when it wasn't professionalized. And yeah, there are things that I'd like to go back to. And because we've professionalized, we've been able to grow and impact so many more communities and do this and keep people and really sustain in communities. And so I can see the benefit of that. I absolutely can. I wonder about the revolution will not be funded, about this whole idea around nonprofit industrial complexes.
I'll put the link to the book in the show notes.
Cool. I don't know if we will ever strike a perfect balance between grassroots and professional spaces, that those two things may always be at ends with each other. But the point is we have put ourselves in this space. And so it is our job to be in that struggle as long as we are choosing to be in that struggle. I'm a metaphor person. I like to paint pictures in my mind, and often back to, again, that first job that I had at a rape crisis center. And we would always post up at the farmers markets and ask people to take our community surveys and chat with folks about our community action teams. And I remember how hard it was to connect with community members, because in my mind, I was like, I have to get them to resonate with anti-sexual and domestic violence. Then I have to explain the connection between that and our work around housing. And then I have to get them to understand prevention and what that is. And I have to get them on board all within 5 minutes.
Just that little thing.
Just that little thing. I didn't have to do all of that. I really didn't. It was not my job to teach them why I was there. It was my job to connect with them. And then we could continue to connect over time. About that same farmers market, of what would happen if it was all coalition folk posted up at a farmers market trying to connect with community, and how successful we would be. I'm going to guess it would be really funny to watch. I would pay to watch that. I don't know how successful we would be.
Maybe this is a new reality show.
Yeah, just pick like the undercover boss, but like the undercover RPE officer, rape prevention education officer. Stick them in community and see how hard it is for us to resonate with community members with our language. That therein lies the problem. Again, it's just this idea that I get it. We all want to be good at our jobs. And in this movement too, because sexual and domestic violence are not easy things to talk about, because folks don't want to talk about them, because there is so much sexism just wrapped around this work. We do feel like we have to prove ourselves, that we're not just angry feminists that people are going to write off. So I understand we use our language and our degrees like armor to prove that we can be in a space. And it makes a lot of sense. But unfortunately, when you live with armor for so long, it becomes really hard to take it off. I was just doing a web conference last week with a couple of amazing presenters, Cherie Tang and Audrey Jordan, about their work on measuring love as prevention and bringing more love and vulnerability into prevention. Both incredible speakers. And they didn't use any professional language. They didn't. They were just like speaking to people's hearts, and it felt really impactful. And I just wonder, what are the spaces that we can intentionally question? Like, what are we doing here? Do we need to be doing this right now? How can we shift and bring more of ourselves in?
How can we be human with each other while in the midst of this really big lift of the work that we're doing? And yeah, I love that. That's a good metaphor. That when you have all the armor of the degrees and the professionalized language and all of that, it's hard to take off, and which means it's really hard to connect. And just like it might be hard to connect at the farmer's market while you're wearing the Angry Feminist t-shirt, it is equally hard to connect at the farmer's market while wearing a t-shirt that says, "We believe in multi-sectoral partners." Not gonna work.
Yep. Oh my gosh, yes.
I might need to make a t-shirt that says, "We believe in the power of multi-sectoral partners."
100%. You should get those t-shirts. I would like to see.
Yeah, that might be an NSAC swag thing that I bring this year is t-shirts to give away that say, "We believe in the power of multi-sectoral partners."
I'll get a t-shirt too.
Great.
You should adjust your language. If this means something to you, you are part of the problem.
Totally. That's great. Just like the Angry Feminist shirt while trying to connect with people at the farmer's market does not work in the same way that "We believe in the power of multi-sectoral partners" does not work. It's that each space has a role to play. That's been something that I've really struggled with through the years. Is at first I was organizer and activist and in the streets doing the things. And then I was educator, policy. And at certain points throughout both of those roles, I would demonize the other one and going, "Oh, they're making it harder to do blah, blah, blah. And they're watering down blah, blah, blah." And it took me a while to realize actually both roles are really important. They're just different roles. And even one person can play multiple roles, usually not at the same moment, but they can play multiple roles throughout their lives. One is not better or more necessary. And they inform each other in a lot of ways that we often don't talk about. A lot of the language that then gets to academic spaces or policy spaces came from that organizing space. And it just took a while to get there. And it is the money that comes from sometimes the policy space that can fund that organizing. Not always, but sometimes. And it just comes back to over and over again that we need it all. It's always a D, all of the above.
And okay, so maybe you're not the person that is going to be at the legislature in your 9 to 5 and protest in your 5 to 10. Okay, at least acknowledge the value of both. For me, I'm a big, call it what it is, girly. So I struggle in spaces that say that they want to open doors, when folks say they want to open doors, but are actively closing doors. I used to work at a university for a short period of time. And I remember this whole thing about language, that was like a very big thing there. And I was like, okay, but what if you just said you actually didn't care what community members think? Because that's kind of sensing here.
That went really well.
I'm no longer at the university. I came back here. I know there's a point to it, but I really do believe that the vast majority of people who are doing prevention really believe in what we're doing. And they really believe in the power of community. And they really do want to do the right thing. They might just be old school, or they might be afraid of doing something different, or they might be afraid of losing the dollars. What I have found, and I can't speak for everyone, but the folks that I have interacted with really want to make it work. Funders want to make it work. And again, if you're listening to this and you're in a coalition or a public health department space and you want to be doing health equity work actually in practice, you want to be centering communities, this is the job, baby girl. We get to do the hard stuff. We get to have those really hard conversations and we get to make it work because we put ourselves here. If I wanted to be comfortable all the time, I could go back to the first job that I had in this movement, but I'm here and I try to think about what I can do with this time while I am here.
That make it work space is so often undervalued or written off as compromising away your values or any of those pieces. And again, it comes down to that demonizing extremes when in fact it really takes a whole lot of making it work in sometimes unideal circumstances or sometimes with unideal language or language that serves me in one space but not in other spaces. A whole lot of dedication to making it work that actually moves things forward. And it's not always fun. It's not always pretty. It's usually not pretty and not tweetable. It doesn't produce good sound bites. All of the daily grind that goes into the making it work. And it's what keeps us moving. That's been one of my big shifts in the last couple of years is realizing that places like departments of health, as tricky as it can be, that the everyday, really boring work of keeping things going is unendingly valuable in making it possible for me to do my job and for our programs to do their jobs. And that when individuals within those systems and the systems themselves are willing to also make it work and be creative about how language can be interpreted or be brave about trying something new, that even the drudgery of those systems can be really deeply impactful in ways that I hadn't really given credit to previously. And that's been a nice shift for me. It makes me actually really hopeful instead of constantly going, wrong, state government. Makes me like pretty hopeful, which is a nice place for me to be.
Yeah, I hear that. I feel that too. And yeah, I also want to be super clear. It is also keep track of your own safety. And it can't just be one person at an organization being like, I'm gonna say all the hard stuff all the time. It takes commitment across the board. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that preventionist with a lot of moxie who wasn't afraid to ask a question or to be like, hey, have you thought about saying it this way at a conference? And it seems to me sometimes like we lose a lot of moxie the longer that we're here. And of course we do. It's exhausting, the constant learning and trying to fit into a box. And to be honest, often since I have focused less on fitting into that box all the time, I'm like, people must hate me. And I probably look so stupid right now and I should just go away. And then I constantly have to be like, it's okay. No one has said that they hated you. You are doing something for somebody. This discomfort that you feel is okay. And then lean on your support when you can. I know that it's not easy. I just think that, like you said about hopefulness, I just think preventionists are so freaking awesome. And we are really brave and we're not afraid to do this stuff. And I just want to see us dig into that strength a little bit more again. I would love to see that moxie come back and maybe ask, do we need to include the social ecological model in this presentation to community members? Maybe not. And then just see what happens. Let the chips fall where they may. Say, I understand. I love the social ecological model. That's awesome. I don't think 17-year-olds need to know it in order to know what prevention is.
And now that we're talking about prevention as health equity, that's the other question is, do we need to explicitly talk about sexual violence in order to do sexual violence prevention? And that's a huge shift in language, is do I have to lead with that in order to do this work all the time? And it turns out, no, you don't have to. And that's okay. And that one's going to take a while for us to shift around.
It is.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, all of this always comes back to we need it all. Each term has a place and a purpose, and it's figuring out where do they belong and where do I belong in the context of that language, do I still belong in this work if I don't immediately get it? Is there still a space for me to do this meaningfully? And maybe someone else can help me translate the things that I'm already doing meaningfully into health equity language.
And about the two ends of the spectrum. If you are a preventionist who is sitting in a meeting or a web conference and feeling really lost because you don't understand the terminology, I promise you, you are still an expert in the work that you do. Like, you don't need to bring anything else to the table. All of that stuff, those are sprinkles. Like, you got the sundae. That's what matters. You can get the sprinkles if you want. You're not lacking if you don't have the sprinkles. And if you are someone who uses that language all the time because you feel really empowered to use it, that is amazing. I love that for you. And you're always going to be in a space with the person without the sprinkles. And just be mindful. I really want us to try our best to be mindful of how we might make other folks feel without thinking about it.
Yeah. So what would that look like for you in practice?
This is a conversation that I've had too. I've had people challenge me and be like, but people need to know the language to be able to get the funding. And I say, for sure. In practice, it means talking about what the language actually means. It means like really understanding, if you're going to say the term health equity, say what health equity actually means. Talk about that. And then if you want to throw in a sentence of, and this is referred to as health equity, or frame it less as a mandatory to do the work and more as a tool to help you get funding. It looks like when we're having a conversation that uses a lot of academic language, more disclaimers. If these words aren't resonating with you, you're still a part of this. We want you to be a part of this, and giving people the tools to get information on that language if they want. It means putting ourselves in uncomfortable positions and letting things go, more cold calls, more connecting with folks, opening ourselves to learning and relearning and thinking about the place that we hold. If we know the language and our community partners know the work, how can we work together to get the thing? We both have skills. We don't need to know how to do what they're doing. They don't need to know how to do what we're doing. We do have to be willing to work together.
Janae Sargent, thank you so much for coming on Both And. This has been a joy.
Thank you so much for having me. I adore you, and I've adored this conversation.
Back at you. Mutual Appreciation Club. Thank you for listening to Both And. Both And is a project of the New Mexico Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, and this episode was made possible by the New Mexico Department of Health. Both And is produced by me, Jess Clark, and edited by the fabulous Daisha Clay at Pillow Fort Studios. Intro music was written by Michelle Shamuel, and the logo designed by Alex Rossreed. You can find links to the articles and papers we mentioned in the show notes, and as always, you can reach me with questions, comments, and even disagreements at jessc@nmcsap.org. Thank you, and I'm so looking forward to next time.
Prevent Connect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control. You can find more information about this episode, along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at preventconnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we need your help ensuring that this podcast and others like it reaches listeners like you. Take a second to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up on main podcasting pages and reach new listeners. And of course, if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to see us cover, reach out to us and comment on this post on our Instagram page.